Welcome back to the Shared Experience Summit. I'm really thrilled to introduce you to Bill Thatcher, who I've known for going on 2 decades now. Bill and I often joke about the fact that we met in prison, and Bill was guiding a community building workshop at San Quentin Penitentiary, the California State Prison. And he invited me as a guest, and it blew my mind. Ever since then, I've been looking for that same experience of authentic community. And I found that in all of these other circumstances, in almost every case, when people get to a certain point, which Bill will talk more about, to this point of chaos, rather than moving through it and getting to authentic community, they wind up regressing to what we know as pseudo community in this M. Scott Peck model. So with that, Bill, where would you like to start in this conversation?
Maybe start with my mentor in this whole process, and that was M. Scott Peck, someone well known in the 80s and 90s. I had several New York Times bestseller books. The first one was The Road Less Traveled. I think that was on the New York Times bestseller list for a decade. It's one of those books that ended up on people's living room counter, the coffee table, but a lot of people never read it, but I did. And it started a whole process for me with Scotty in terms of each one of his books seemed to be a capstone to something that had gone on in my life. And so I always looked with interest whenever I saw a new book of his coming up. And that happened for me back in a point in time when I was an international communications consultant working with nonprofits around the world, involved in leading workshops on team building. And I was just getting ready to go on a workshop in Marseille, France, and happened to be in a bookstore. This was back in the time when you visited bookstores to get your books, and saw he had a new book out, which is called The Different Drum on Community Making and Peace. And I grabbed it and read it on the flight over to Marseille, actually. And in reading it, I said, this is what people want. I mean, they want community building. They don't want team building. And I've often described the difference between community building and team building as the difference between a back rub and deep tissue massage, with community building being the real deep piece of it. Well, what really threw me was the opening line in Scotty's introduction to the Different Drum, which was, in and through community lies the salvation of the world. And it just stopped me, because it's not, I'd always thought community was good to have, and I certainly enjoyed being in community when it happened as compared to being out of community, but to see it as the salvation of the world. So that grabbed me, and I started both reading the book with real interest to see what is this fundamental piece that he sees as being true of it, as well as finally, this was like his fifth book that I had read. And he always, as a writer, he put his address in his book, which no other author of that stature I had ever seen do that. But I'd always resisted writing him because I didn't want to be just one more of the 1,000 people whose letters came in that day. But I swallowed my pride and I wrote him, sent it off, and lo and behold, he actually responded to me and wrote me back. And then we got on the phone and talked, and that began more than a decade of relationship with Scotty. And in fact, the first community building workshop I went to was one that he facilitated. And so for me, my community building experience, while I took it further than Scotty had at that point in time, it really, I could never have done it without the kind of mentorship that he provided in my life.
Really interesting. I mean, you really went out into your growth edge, and that was a a transformational experience. So I'm interested in this, in what you described as the difference between team building and community building. And I'm wondering why, I mean, it's clear why community building hasn't become more common in the corporate realm. You know, teams are easy from the sense that it's like sports or military and all these other metaphor systems. Um, Corporations are designed hierarchically, you know, with people telling you what to do. Um, so what, have there been many experiments or tests? What are the challenges of community making in a corporation?
Well, first off, my experience of community building is why it's not that popular is because it actually involves a struggle. It's a struggle by a group of people to communicate without superficiality or distortion or animosity. Um, and a lot of what we do in life is we put up who we want people to see us as. So we have this facade that we put out, and this is us. You know, it's sort of like a puppet show where you're controlling the puppet, but you want people to look at the puppet. Don't look at the puppeteer. The whole attempt is to say, I'm going to give you what I think you want to see in order to accept me.
Mm,
Because my fear, one of my greatest fears, is to not be accepted. And that goes back to one of the fears that I've heard you talk about often, which is the primal fear of being ostracized from the community, which back in the early time of humanity meant you died without community, without being in that tribe. So that fear remains in us to this day. So that even in looking at what comes across my social media feed, there's a tightness that can happen if I see somebody not accepting what I've said. So it's one of the reasons why that's sort of like a love-hate relationship in that I want to belong, but in order for you to accept me, you have to know me. And I'm afraid for you to know me because I believe if you know me, you're not going to accept me. If you really knew who I was, boy, you'd be running for the hills.
mm. And that really fits with, you know, when people have their executive front, I mean, they assume that all of those things that they've done that have gotten them to that position, that armor, that mask, that pretense is what people value. And so they're gonna, you know, man, you're not gonna take that off. I'm gonna fight with everything I have.
Yeah. Yeah, and at least part of my experience is that um, there's I have been threatening my wife that I was going to write another book called Truths, Five Lies We Believe and Five Truths We Don't. Which one of the lies I'm just fascinated by those lies that are put forward as being truths, and some of them are very basic. Like I grew up with, you know, big boys don't cry, um, as a way of controlling my emotions, which took me into therapy in order to actually find my emotions as a man, to be able to unlock them. One of those that relates to being known is really around that whole issue of if people know me, then they won't accept me, and if I'm really, you know, everybody else has their act together. That's the piece that sort of is put forward. You're so together. How could I ever measure up to what you're doing? And if you knew how messy my office was, you just wouldn't accept me. That kind of thing that um, the self judgment actually sabotages our ability to reach out. We're thinking about ourselves instead of looking at the other person and seeing how can I be loved? How can I accept this person? Because that's the magic. That's the potion that really connects people to us is when we reach out to others.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is now with Brene Brown being everywhere, people are talking about shame and talking about separation in a very different way. The challenge is that her work springs from her research. So everything, even though her stories are wonderful and they're emotional and they're engaging and people get those aha moments, it does lack the yes, but how. The and if people have never experienced authentic community, then and all the steps in it, where they haven't experienced the chaos and they haven't experienced passing through emptiness, then they don't know what they're going for. I have 3 examples I've been, just really sitting with me where I really wish community building was in the world in a bigger way, community making, so that people would be more familiar with these. One is an organization that both of us participated in, where it was just tragic. I mean, you could see these times when the group would get into chaos and it would be very frightening, and they would use what they knew, these tools. And what happens in community building, you would explain this difference between a cult and a community. And the cult, one or more individuals wind up having their viewpoint becoming the dominant viewpoint. It's sort of like if everyone has this ego self other axis that's very straight, at some point those get warped and the cult has something here, this purpose. Whereas a community at every moment strengthens each of those individuals. And there was someone within that organization who was familiar with their work, this organization's work, and familiar with community building. And they said both get to the same end to a different path. And I found that that wasn't actually true, that organization did not actually strengthen the individual in relationship in the same way that community building would. The 2 other examples I have, we have this fight, this struggle, this challenge with rock wool, the toxic plant here. Well, the resistance movement just kept fragmenting. And I purposefully tried to bring in some community building, but if no one else understood that, then it was still this like, chaos is bad. We've got to banish the people who are causing the problem or change the people who are causing the problem, because there is a way to get rid of this organization, this toxic polluter. And then the final was just recently in a very small group of only 3 people. We were working together, and I could see very clearly that moment when someone started bringing up expectations and what was going to happen in the future, and what sort of having these questions about XYZ, and then gauging the responses and then judging the responses. And the other person literally saw conflict and got affected by the conflict, and even sent a message in this thread of that she was physically ill because of the toxicity. And then, whereas having been in San Quentin in this incredibly powerful program, one thing you had said to me that was so important is that people pass through emptiness at different times and be aware of it. And when it happened, it was like this feeling of peace, this void. And I kind of looked around and I wondered who else felt it. And I could still see this, there were still people who were like getting ready to storm out, that just couldn't handle it. And, this goes back to sort of the reason we're working on SCOBY together is because we've been talking for almost 2 decades about, can you foster authentic community on different time scales online as something that's an ongoing daily practice rather than a circumscribed program.
Right. So maybe it'd be helpful for people watching to hear the four stages
Yeah.
and how that works out, because there are basically, Scotty identified four stages. He was very clear in saying there was really only one stage that he considered that he introduced to people, because starting in World War II, there were different leaders in the world that talked about group process. And you've heard of perhaps storming, forming, norming, performing kind of words for it. Um, in Scotty's book, and when I read it, he presented it in quite a linear way, which is not what I found to be. It's more like what you were talking about in terms of San Quentin, where people are in different places in the same room. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But the four stages are pseudo community, which, and I should say at the beginning, all four stages are useful and beneficial. They're not cheap. Like pseudo community might sound like it's not worth it, but it's important for us in our lives. There are times when I want to be at a more modest surface level with somebody. If I'm going through the checkout counter at the grocery store and I ask the clerk, how's it going? I don't necessarily expect him or her to say to me, well, I'm really thinking about it, divorcing my wife or my spouse. So, it's like TMI, too much information. Just say, yeah, things are good. So that's pseudo community, is sort of surface stuff. And when we start getting to know people, we talk about things that we know. Oh, do you know the Rams? Are you a fan of the Washington team, or the Seahawks in Seattle, or whatever? You find those things where there's a common connection, and they're easy to find. That's what happens at cocktail parties, for example. The next stage is, and it often does happen that in a relationship, in a primary relationship, where we start out at that level and we find out the things that we have in common, we begin to see where we're different. And those things that are different is what gets introduced as the stage two, which is chaos, which is I begin to see a difference and we begin to struggle on whose norms are going to predominate. So chaos is an uncomfortable kind of setting for most of us. We don't like being unsettled, and that unsettledness causes us to search for a way out. And for many of us, in our experience of being in groups, what will happen is when a group gets to that intense place, it'll go back into pseudo community. So there, if you're in a church or a religious community, there typically are some topics you don't discuss in the community, even though that should be the place where you should be able to discuss everything. But no, there's certain things you don't talk about politics, whatever that list is for the group, you stay away from them because those send you into chaos, and then you have to go back into pseudo community. The third stage, and this is the stage that Scotty introduced, was emptiness, because I have a choice to either revert back to being on a surface level with you, or to let go of my control of the situation. And that's how I get into emptiness. And it's a scary place because in most religious traditions, it has this component, and it's often referred to as death. It feels like I'm giving up, that I'm letting go, that I'm dying. If I can't convince you, and this is what the community building process does that Scotty introduced, is you sort of struggle through the process until you're just at your wits end and you say, I give up. I've tried to do everything to get you guys organized so we could have community, and nothing I've tried has worked. So I just give up. That's the emptiness piece. And it can be quite violent in the sense of, really being pissed off, and yet that letting go creates space in the room and inside of me for something new to be welcomed. And that's the fourth stage, community. And in the process of working with groups, and I was president of Scotty's nonprofit for about 5 years, what we train facilitators to lead groups in community building. And we were very clear that we were only training them to lead groups to facilitate the process to emptiness, because the belief was that community is a gift and it can't be manipulated. It can't be forced on a group. A group has to choose it. So creating the place where there is a sufficient component of emptiness then offers the opportunity for the whole group, if they don't experience it, to at least acknowledge that it's happened. And where we met in prison, I mean, where could you think of a more weird place to have community? I mean, if there's anything in prison that the men and women that go there realize, is you do not want to be known. You know, that is a disaster, because people will take advantage of you if they know something about you, what your weakness is. And being known is really about saying, you know, this is who I am. So we were always careful in prison that when we worked with groups, they were groups in a residential program, like a drug treatment program, that were separated from the general prison population, just to provide a level of maturity and safety that wouldn't be present if you just had somebody that was really opening up in a group and then they're going out into the general prison population, which would have just made them like lambs for the slaughter. So there's a wisdom to how we do this, but there's also a great payoff in terms of the benefits of being known and working through the lies that I've told myself about what would happen if people really knew me for who I was.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I remember Mike just so vividly because there were different exercises that you would do with other people. And I just remember that conversation sitting with him. And I remember thinking afterwards, after this whole experience, that Mike and several other people I trusted more completely than almost anybody else I knew. And I would have trusted them to take care of my children. It was just because we actually saw and heard each other as human beings.
Mm.
It was really interesting that that experience that the incarcerated men would have when they came back, you know, from breaks, from days, the other thing, you know, where they were seeing all of the drama in the rest of the prison, because of course prisons are they are designed to separate people, not to connect people. The whole lesson is you aren't worthy, you're being separated, you're being punished.
Yeah.
It was just, yeah, I mean, I really did see that so powerfully. And one of the biggest takeaways for me was a prison is a container of people, just like a school or a home or an office building or a church, no different. And it's only to the extent, or a hospital. And it's only artifice. It's only that pretense of our pseudo community roles that prevents it from being so much deeper and our experience of life so much richer.
Right. And what you just said about what the guys would do when in the midst of the community living workshop, when they'd go out into the yard, they'd come back and say, my God, all of the drama triangles that are going on here, you know. And that's the key point of what I want to stress about community building for anyone that's wants to engage with it. It's not just about experiencing the kind of, you know, the deep bonding and authentic connection. It's also about knowing the process. It's like you become a person with eyesight in a land of blind people. And that's what I would tell the men and women in prison. I would say, what you're getting here in this community piece, you can take back into your communities once you're released and offer a level of understanding of group that no one else in your community there will have. It gives you a standing, and that's an important piece. So I think the understanding, one, that the 4 stages happen at the same time in a group. Some people are in chaos, some people are in emptiness, some people are in pseudo community. Knowing that I can move from pseudo community into emptiness. I mean, I've been in one community, only one, but one community building workshop where the whole group moved from pseudo community through chaos into emptiness without anyone saying a word. It was incredible in terms of just the dynamic that happened without one verbal comment. So um,
Just,
I
I don't quite understand that. You mean no people were in silence the entire time or in those transitions?
yeah, the entire time.
For what, 2 days?
No, no, this was like for a day.
Uh-huh. Wow.
By the end of the day, I mean, it wasn't out of the blue in the sense that there had been conversations that had happened, but then the group went silent, and
Huh.
then we just watched the group
Yeah,
just move, go into emptiness. So
it's fascinating.
um, I've when I read Scotty's book, I came away thinking it was linear, pseudo community, chaos, emptiness, community. And I discovered the first time I went through the process is it wasn't. And I've used this term to describe what it is. It's not linear, and it's not the other term was cyclical. It's not even that. It's nested. So within this same space, all of that's happening, and I can be bouncing between any one of them at any given time. But when the group as a whole reaches what is undefined in terms of the critical mass of people emptying, then community happens. And that's the piece that's just so mystical and magical in the sense
Hmm.
of what happens for a group. But most important is what you said in that group that we've shared experience with, when they would go into chaos, and I would see that, I would think, if we just had the community building tools here, then somebody could say, oh, we're in chaos, you know I can see we're in chaos. Then the group can decide, do we want to stay here? Is this productive? Because sometimes chaos can be very effective in, say, brainstorming, where people are talking over each other and you're just trying to generate different new ideas. That's chaos, and that can be very productive. But if I'm trying to work with my son who's having problems in school and we're just constantly in chaos, that's not going to serve us. So being able to know where we are and then make a choice for, do I want to stay here or do I choose to go somewhere else?
Yeah, and those tools, I mean, that's what's really interesting because it's there's still a level of power struggle, dominance, control that happens within chaos that you have to let go of. And if you don't know what you're going for, and that's the thing that we experienced in this organization was they have tools for a lot of things. And so they would adopt their tools to do what it was essentially, well, I have all these tools and processes, so I'm going to apply them. But when you have a new challenge, an adaptive challenge, something you haven't faced before, then those aren't necessarily going to work for you. It was fascinating. In that, I mean, there are all of these subtle practices. I think it was around 7 or so that were just also very simple. But when everybody adopted those, one of them I remember was using I statements, so that because even subtle comments can wind up being oppressive. And I've really become more attuned to that on social media, et cetera, where, if someone says, uh, divorce is awful, was one of, the examples you gave, you know, someone else could think, well, that's my divorce is the best thing that ever happened to me. But they might not say it out loud because they believe that they're out of alignment, that there's that threat of being excluded. So, they're not going to say, yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, they might in some ways, in some circumstances. That's how hazing happens and sexual assault and other things with groups. They'll go along to do it, but other times they'll just remain silent. And there's just this, I'm not seen and heard, I'm not valued because someone spoke for me, however that was.
So so flip it, because you got halfway there. So what did you learn in terms of how do you say what's true for you
Oh
without
yeah,
excluding the other
yeah.
person?
No, my divorce was fabulous. It's one of the best things that ever happened to me. And then that totally leaves it open for someone else to say, wow, I had a really different experience.
Yeah.
and,
Exactly.
not impressed.
Yeah, and that ties into one of the other false beliefs, which is I'm actually trying to include you by saying we.
Mm,
Okay, so we know that divorce is terrible. Is a way of my saying I'm embracing everyone, but if my divorce wasn't terrible, you've excluded me. So so that's why it's important the words we use. So if I say my divorce was the best thing that ever happened, that allows you, if your divorce wasn't, to still be in the room.
yeah,
Um,
it, that really brings me back to the this Rockall protest situation, where there was a community organizer, a leader who really used cult-like techniques, which are probably very common in the labor movement, but everything was we. And that's probably what led most to the disruption. And there was something you said before about um, letting go in that situation that made me think, that brought me back to that other situation around expectations, which is really where the chaos happened, where we were planning work together, and one of the members of this small group wanted to really define what was expected of them, and then there was this whole conversation about expectations and what we're doing, and I was hosting this group, so I said, I'd respond, but I could tell if there was a level of, and it all goes back to that same anxiety, of what is the willingness to experience something completely new? Like, how completely can I let go of control? You essentially do have to have trust to start the process, and you have to have, I believe, maybe, I don't like to use how have to, but maybe you want to, or maybe this is part of the agreements at the beginning, like that agreement of participating for the 3 days, because a lot of people couldn't. I mean, not a lot, but there were some people who just stood up and walked out, who just couldn't handle it. They would rather, they'd probably rather die than really show themselves and see other people.
well, two things I'd say. One is in prison, many of the guys simply making it through the 3 days was a victory because in life, what they had learned was there were two ways to respond to uncomfortable situations, which is a nice way of saying, really bad settings. One is to fight, which wasn't allowed in this group, or to leave. And so to stay present when the agitation is going on inside was a major growth moment for those men and women. And they stated that at times at the end, that was one of the biggest takeaways that they had. But the second thing I would say is that's what's important about creating a container for this to work. It's like Johnny Depp in Pirates of the Caribbean. He's talking about how the pirates how they had their act together. And he said, well, they're not really rules. They're more like guidelines in terms of talking about how they set up their social setting. And that's true. We call in community building, we have a set of guidelines. And so one of them is using I statements. Another one is um, speaking when you're moved to speak and not speaking when you aren't moved to speak. What does moved to speak mean? Some people spend the whole 3 days exploring that thing that they'd never encountered in their life before, because people are often uncomfortable with silence. So they'll just blab in order to fill the silent space. Whereas one of the guidelines is be comfortable with silence in the group. How many of us sit in a group of 20, 30, 40, 50 people when there's 4 or 5 minutes of silence? Talk about awkward, uncomfortable. Those things are all part of this experience. So the guidelines create a safe container for this experimentation to happen. Because for many of us, while we haven't experienced very often in our whole lives, and Scotty talks about it in the introduction to his book, he says most of us haven't ever experienced genuine community. but when we have, it's often come at a great price. So we've been hurt in some way, and we're looking for how to avoid that hurt happening again. And much like in love, community building is something that I have to be willing to risk in order to see um, the benefits that come from connecting with people. And rather than like in cults, where our effort is to extinguish anything that's different, in community, it's all about celebrating our difference.
Mm.
It's you don't have to be like me. I realize that I'm completed by what the difference that you bring to the group. So we talk about it being a group of all leaders. It's not a group of all followers of a leader.
Yeah, and I'm really preferring the term that I've been using, which is guides, and guiding and being guided, a group of all guides. Um,
I like that
we're,
too. Yep.
we're really showing each other um, our blind spots, what we've encountered that
Right.
might serve somebody else, a way around an obstacle. Um, there there was something else that was important, a very important experience that related to the drama triangle um, of the savior, rescuer, and persecutor, and or the rescuer, persecutor, and victim, um, where one of your co-facilitators was standing in the front of the room, being very vulnerable and authentic, and spoke of a rape that had happened in the past. And one of the participants stood up and went to console her, hug her, and she said, "Don't rescue me." And that's another part of that dynamic that subtly plays out so often. I mean, almost constantly in almost every news article you read, or, certainly dramas on TV. I mean, everywhere. And that's also what that subtle dynamic of people not feeling safe, not believing that they're safe, sorry, uh, not having their own safe space, so that they wind up blaming, meaning, okay, there's a persecutor and I'm a victim,
Right.
or I've got to change something, correct something about this person, which is going to put me in a persecutor perspective for them, and then somebody else trying to fix the whole thing, and it's exhausting and it's constant, and it's something that's fundamentally not taught. And this is the thing that's really most interesting, because there's bullying and how are we going to punish bullies, right? And how are we going to stop people from doing this? And it all becomes about education, as opposed to the bringing people through an experience, so that they have these x-ray specs, these spectacles that allow them to see the situations all around them, and then show, okay, here's how you can facilitate and bring community to bear.
Yeah. And so often a person in that environment of a drama triangle ends up in all three positions at some point in the process. I mean, you tell a story about your own life as a young boy and a bully. Tell that, in terms of.
Yeah, well, it was so Charlie, I won't use his last name, down the block used to, when we were biking around the cul-de-sac near us, or at the bus stop, he would beat up my brother and I would intervene. So my brother was the victim. He's, the persecutor. I was going to be the savior who was, and then Charlie would beat me up. And my mom went over to their house and said, had a ripped shirt, or, was showing what happened. And Charlie's mom said something that will always sit with me, which is, well, David tortures Charlie intellectually, which you could say, okay, that's my first reaction is that there's something maybe anti-Semitic there, like, that she's, or anti-intellectual, or, whatever it is. There's, some, um, so I can go back all of a sudden into the victim and say, okay, now the mom's persecuting me, or this or that. But it really did cause me, over these decades, I mean, who knows, I was 11 or 12 back then, over the decades, to really sit with that and understand how powerful words are. And every word I used, I'm sure caused just as much pain, because I didn't know what Charlie's situation was. I mean, who knows how those words resonated with him in terms of his own self-esteem, and what he was struggling with. So it really is important to see, and this goes into these other things of actually being aware of your feelings and how important those are, where in these situations, if your whole time you're protecting yourself. And that's one of the interesting things, is that Scotty's system, this community making, what I see is really important with SCOBY is connecting these various systems. Like I see stuff in Bill Plotkin's Soulcraft, like the Way of Counsel and other elements, and Four Arrows, metacognitive trance-based learning, Cat Fawn, and even in Brad Brown's work, like there are all of these elements, and it seems like there's only one piece of it. There's only one thing, which is, in the past, we had saints, and we had seers, and we had shaman, and we had sages, whatever the culture was. If I was in the East, you would have the sage, a Confucius, a Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, who were these guides and these models. And we just don't fundamentally have that in our culture. Like, mentors are all about doing things, about, they teach you productivity, they teach you to be a cog in a machine. They don't teach you to bring your gifts forward in order to, and those gifts are your feelings. Those are what resonates, and how you reflect back, and how you echo the other, how you commune in a group. It's like the one most important thing. And that's why I agree with Scotty Peck that this is the salvation, and I really do believe that he saw it as a technology. Others look at it as processes, as tools, as other things. I still think it is just one thing, which Four Arrows calls metacognitive trance-based learning. It's opening yourself up enough where you put yourself in a trance, meaning you're fully open and accepting, and you facilitate that in the other person, so that there can be an actual communion.
Can I just
Yeah.
suggest maybe something? I think it's aligned with that, but maybe not quite in that channel. And that is one of the things that's clear about community building, that Scotty avoided prescriptions, but he talked about principles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the principles, and applying the principles, I love the thought of, we're guides guiding one another. That's an image that really rests with me. And I think if we're practicing a set of principles, which is what my dream is for SCOBY, that principles like communicating with authenticity, dealing with difficult issues, welcoming and affirming diversity. You see where I'm going? These principles that can actually create the space where what you're talking about actually comes through, because without thinking about self-hypnosis, I actually get to that space because I'm practicing the kinds of things that in turn produce that. So relating with love and respect is another principle, and tolerance of ambiguity. Those are all things that if we sort of say, here's here's the principles that we believe can really foster what we're going for in SCOBY, that can actually be the vehicle for it happening.
Well, it's so interesting because, you had talked about people moving through these phases in silence, and that actually makes sense because it's so often the words that screw us up. We have different, it's the bug in the box problem. I say a word and you think it means something completely different. Like, I call something a bug and you think you're looking in your box and, you assume that we're looking at the same thing, but it could be something completely different. Brene Brown calls it wholeheartedness, that state. And where what you call principles, because we call them guides within SCOBY, I called them guidelines. And I actually adopted some of the things that you spoke about as part of the SCOBY Society membership guidelines. The guidelines will work if they become embodied. If the guides maintain the guidelines, and that to me becomes this concept of a map. So that, and a map does have a common legend you can all look at. So when somebody is talking about fear, or somebody is talking about or trauma, or talking about whatever they're talking about, if we lay that out on a map and we have a legend, and then we have guidelines on how we act together, how we work together as fellow travelers within this map, then the community and the communities flourish, because people who are in this community can join someone in another community, and they're all communities, and everyone knows what you're talking about when you say community or ecosystem. And that to me is, so that's another sort of lexical shift I took, because communities, people, like when I talked to a friend once, they kind of got offended when I suggested that Shepherdstown is pseudo community. They say, well, I have these friends, I have this group, and we're this and that. And it didn't work. But when you talk about an ecosystem and the purpose of an ecosystem, that pseudo community and that chaos become much more important, because you have different people in this ecosystem, and it's more fertile. So those are just the slight shifts that I'm working, so that all of these different principles, Four Arrows calls them precepts, just whatever it is, so that we can have a common lexicon, at least within this one ecosystem of SCOBY.
Well, and I think you're also introducing some new thoughts, and I'm reminded of, if you'll allow me to talk about my own spiritual background, in that in the teachings of Jesus Christ, when he talked about the kingdom of God, he was describing something that had not been seen before. And there are some pieces to this that have that kind of an echo that haven't been seen before. And when you talk about hypnosis, people get a little edgy. They get it's a little uncomfortable when you start. I don't want to. I mean, that sounds like a cult to me. So there are pieces of this, and ecosystem is another one that has more meaning and terminology today, but still it's not, the masses have not embraced it. So what Jesus did when he was trying to introduce something that people had never seen before, he said, the kingdom of heaven is like, and he used things from the common man and woman's day-to-day experience to describe what it was. So he said, the kingdom of heaven is like the sower that goes out to sow. And they throw out the seed, and some of the seed, so finding those ways to not expect people to make the leap to you in terms of the definition, but where you can say from your own experience, this is like what we're suggesting is like, and then you use an experience that a person can readily identify with. If we can find those ways to do that, we can hasten or at least encourage or make it more welcoming of people to learn um, what we're talking about in this space. So that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting. And I'm gonna remove the third wall for a moment in terms of this context, because today we did, people are going to watch this in the future, but today we had an experience that to me was one of the most enriching and encouraging of my life, because on Scobie for the first time, we had someone join from South Africa and upstate New York. And I don't even know where some of the other people were beaming in from, West Coast, East
Seattle.
Coast, Seattle. Yeah. Um, and I heard 3 or 4 times in that conversation with Sophie Strand, I heard words and combinations of words that shifted my understanding and brought forward even more clearly what I was going for. Where I would bring up a topic, or someone else brought up a topic. I mean, there was one person who brought up the hero's journey in this way that allowed me to see it differently. I probably had 5 or 6 important openings in that conversation. It was 90 minutes, so this is just incredibly encouraging that I don't, and that was one of the big reliefs for me. And the real relief of community building, as you said, you really didn't have to do anything. You would show up and hold the space for the transformations to happen, for people to initiate themselves into the mysteries of their own soul. And I'm really finding that is really possible for more and more people. Like more and more people are going for that. And I'm finding more and more people who are open to that, looking for that.
Yeah, and I think if the guidelines are provided so that people have some kind of sense of how that ecosystem can be created, so that we don't just depend on something happening serendipitously, which is how most of us have experienced community in our life, where we really get connected with people and we go away and say, how did that happen? We marvel at it. We believe it's one of those places we'll point to as signposts in the past of our lives of, boy, I remember when I really connected with that group. But recreating it, I think that's what Scotty brought forward that had been missing. Once he had experienced it, his ability to unpack it and to say, well, if you try this, and he pulled from the Quaker movement, he pulled from beyond and other people to come up with a set of guidelines that, if they're replicated, can provide quite a bit of consistency in outcome. So that's my dream for Scobie, is that by having this online and saying, well, we know we treat people with respect here. So if you're not doing that, then you're not following the guideline that's necessary in order for this kind of genuine, authentic connection to occur.
Mm.
So,
Amen.
yeah, beautiful. I love it.
It's finally really happening after we've been talking about it for almost 2 decades.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's
Well,
just as
thank you.
beautiful as
Thank,
I imagined.
thanks for risking so much to provide this space for something new to emerge.
Hey, really, you too. I mean, I I would have had all the pieces except for the how. If you hadn't invited me into your organization's entrepreneur residence, that provided the missing piece. So
Good.
thank you.
Love you, brother.
Love you too.